until recently, Spanish flu has been what some people call a forgotten pandemic. But it was a huge global calamity. In terms of the number of deaths, we're saying 50 to 100 million, far greater than the casualties of the First World War. Roughly around April, May 1918, when, the carnage of the First World War is graphic and horrendous. But at the same time, this unknown enemy is starting to sweep through the US, Europe, the trenches, and it is recorded by the Spanish press, and it becomes dubbed as the Spanish flu, because they are neutral. Well, at the time in the 1920s, they estimated that maybe 20 million had died. By the late 20th century, that figure had been up to 25 million. In the 21st century, with scientists and historians now getting together to work much more closely, that figure has now been upped to 50 to 100 million people killed. This virus killed more people in the first 25 weeks than HIV/AIDS has killed in 25 years. Horrendous. I mean, those mortality statistics are staggering.
We don't know exactly why some flu strains are much more severe than others and why some of them would be more likely to kill people or cause very severe disease.
What is particular about avian and pandemic viruses is that they replicate deep inside our lungs. When our cells detect this and trigger a very strong innate immune response, this leads to an influx of white blood cells and fluids into our lungs, and it restricts the amount of airspace that we have to breathe.
The symptoms are very graphic and very, very striking. So, it's said that some people drowned in their own phlegm. So if it was hitting or affecting the lungs, people were spurting blood from their ears and their noses. Descriptions of people turning blue or purple. So, it was really, really severe. And people just dropping down in the streets. Those that succumbed to the flu were in the age group 20 to 40 years, which is very unusual for an influenza epidemic or pandemic. And scientists and historians are now still looking to see why.
There's really two ways that people died in 1918. They either died from the initial flu infection, or they died from an enormously strong immune response to that virus, where their lungs just filled up with fluids from trying to attack the virus that got into their lungs.
So traditionally, everyone sort of said, it's the trenches, and, the conditions of the war, and that's why it was so fatal. But then you think, how did it spread so rapidly around the world to places that are not part of the theatre of war? I think the traditional explanation is it starts in Kansas, in an army camp, and then the troops bring it over to the trenches, Europe. But there's still many, many unknowns.
So mathematical modellers have long been interested in the 1918 pandemic, and one of the questions is to try and disentangle how it spread around the world and exactly what the routes have been. Given perfect data, you could work backwards and try to infer where it's come from. Whereabouts does it arrive in a country? Does it arrive multiple times? Or, thinking about multiple countries, where is the first place? If you understand the origin of a pandemic, then you understand something about where it's come from, and maybe you can stop that in future.
Almost certainly it was a bird flu originally. But then, we also know that flu, or something very similar to it, was in pigs at the same time. Maybe it's somebody who works very closely with birds, or who works very closely with pigs, or has some other exposure like that. One of the big, really open questions in flu research and flu public health is, how does the virus adapt from one species to another? How does, for example, a virus in pigs or in birds get into humans and then start transmitting? Then the key question is, how does the virus then adapt within that person to stop being a pig virus or a bird virus and become a human virus? In other words, to be able to transmit from human to human. And it's probably some very quick evolutionary process that is going on within that human, and in many cases won't be successful. but in a few cases will, and that's when the virus can start spreading between humans and become a flu pandemic and then stay in humans as regular seasonal flu.
Just as people were celebrating Armistice Day, there was hope that it was dying down, but then it resurged, and a far more deadly and virulent strain emerged. So this second wave really spread like wildfire, affecting a third or quarter of the population of the world, and it was short-lived, so it petered out not long afterwards, maybe 1920, 1921, but it was in the sense short-lived.
What happened was that virus continued to transmit among humans. In fact, it continued until 1957 to transmit between humans. And probably what happened there is that the virus adapted to humans. It wasn't this avian or swine virus that came in and was accidentally more pathogenic in humans. In our lab here in Cambridge, we study both seasonal flu and pandemic flu from the standpoint of how does the virus evolve and how can we predict that evolution and make vaccines to try to artificially evolve the virus both in the laboratory and in the computer to understand what it's going to do next and to make vaccines against those strains that will evolve in the future. So this is the basic science of studying evolution and trying to predict that evolution, something that nobody's ever been able to do for a complex organism. And then working to use that understanding to make better vaccines. On the pandemic flu side, we do a similar thing where we look to see how that virus is changing, that virus, how it changes in birds and how it changes in, how that virus changes in other species, and to try to see what possible variants out there might be, and again, to make vaccines that could protect against all of those variants that we see.
Flu is very difficult to eradicate because it's constantly mutating and changing its genetic information. We work on the influenza virus, and in particular on the enzyme that copies the genetic information of the virus when it enters our cells. Specifically, we're interested in how this enzyme can do this activity and how it inserts mutations in the viral genome that leads to the formation of new strains to which we need to develop new vaccines. And we are also interested in when this enzyme messes up, how it triggers the innate immune system and helps cause disease.
We really don't know why we haven't seen a pandemic as deadly as the 1918 pandemic. Scientists and public health officials are extremely concerned. The National Risk Register, which is the way that our government plans what are all the risks to civil society in the UK, there's only two events that are up there in terms of the most catastrophic, and that's a terrorist event or a influenza pandemic. There is a real threat that there can be such pandemics. For example, the H5 and the H7 flu viruses that have infected now close to 2,000 people and killed about half of them. There has been with the H7 viruses some transmission from human to human, not very efficient, and it hasn't really taken off. If either of those viruses did adapt to really transmit well between humans, there's a real concern that it could be as bad as the 1918 virus. And this is why there is so much research done for the public good to try to understand what's happening, and so much work done by people in public health and preparing in hospitals in case something like that happens.
Well, experts like to say it's not if, but when. Coming as a mathematician, it's happened a lot of times in the past, it will probably happen again. The 1918 pandemic is difficult because of lack of data, but the most recent influenza pandemic we had was in 2009. And from that pandemic, there is some very good data. If we understand how the 2009 pandemic spread, maybe that tells us something we can use to help control future pandemics. If we can't stop them, the alternative is at least to allocate our resources better to try and reduce the number of cases in each place.
Looking back 100 years to the last pandemic also invites the question of 100 years from now, what will we be like in terms of how well we are protected against flu, or what things we could do to protect ourselves in some situations? Surely we'll be in a situation where We know more about what viruses are in the world and where they are. Surveillance will be so much better. Surely we'll be in a better situation where we have better drugs and better vaccines because we know more about the virus, so we know more about its weaknesses. We know more about our immune systems, and we know how to enable them to fight those pathogens better. At some point, we will have a universal vaccine that will protect us against flu for the rest of our lives. When this is a whole other question. There are a great number of approaches and really good ideas to doing this. There are already attempts at this that are at a quite advanced stage. It might be 10 years from now. It might be 20 or 30 or 40 years from now. We really don't know.
in healthy-looking pigs, months, perhaps years ago. A new coronavirus spread silently within herds. Gradually, farmers started getting sick. Infected people got a respiratory illness with symptoms ranging from mild flu-like signs to severe pneumonia. The sickest required intensive care. Many died. Experts agree unless it is quickly controlled, it could lead to a severe pandemic, an outbreak that circles the globe and affects people everywhere.
The mission of the Pandemic Emergency Board is to provide recommendations to deal with the major global challenges arising in response to an unfolding pandemic. The board is comprised of highly experienced leaders from business, public health, and civil society.
We could be looking at double the number of cases in 1 week and 16 times as many in a month if we are not able to stop the spread. That would be on the order of 500,000 cases, and it would continue to rise exponentially. In 3 months, we could be approaching 10 million cases.
We're at the start of what's looking like it will be a severe pandemic. And there are problems emerging that can only be solved by global business and governments working together.
We have known about caps-like viruses in animals and people for decades, but have not been successful at developing a licensed vaccine. And sure, there are new technologies that may help, but it's going to be difficult. I am not optimistic about having a vaccine in time to be relevant during this pandemic.
So the policy crisis in question for this board in this meeting is this: how should governments, business, and international organizations allocate and distribute pandemic antivirals and medical supplies to the people who need them most?
What we've seen work very well in the HIV field is, in fact, procurement through the Global Fund. So having a centralized mechanism, so financially able to procure on behalf of affected countries can be critical. I think the second thing is it's going to be very important that for the business sector, for manufacturers of antivirals, that we have clarity around what the need is and where the need is and who are making the decisions.
I think that given that the countries most affected are those that are low and middle income countries with unequal access to technology, to finances, the UN has a worldwide footprint, universally recognized, and universal membership.
A global stockpile would certainly help ensure more rational and strategic allocation, but the reality is that we don't have the logistics capability, even within the UN, to bring that together in one place and run it. So this is where I think a collaboration between the international organizations like the World Health Organization and the private sector, which runs these supply chains for many purposes every day, understand where the supplies are, make smart decisions about how to allocate them to the people who need them in the places that need them the most, and then work with the industry to move those supplies from where they are today to where they need to be.
Just to underscore the point that cooperation among supply chain providers or businesses that have huge supply chains can add a lot of efficiency to the whole process.
The question is, can you, through this international mechanism, really promote commitments to doing this as quickly as possible and give people a sense that actually if they contribute more, that they will have a better chance of protecting their own populations and their country's security and health.
So to be completely clear, most of this production would already be committed in contracts.
Yes.
It is almost unheard of that people are producing product without having a forward commitment for the consumption of that product. So the first thing that needs to be done, because this is not something that the countries currently control, unless countries are going to bring about emergency situations and co-opt an existing supply chain.
I think it's not likely, I agree, that countries are not going to buy countermeasure to put into a global supply without retaining a large portion of it for themselves.
Public health agencies have issued travel advisories, while some countries have banned travel from the worst affected areas. As a result, the travel sector is taking a huge hit. Travel bookings are down 45% and many flights have been canceled. A ripple effect is racing through the service sector. Governments that rely on travel and tourism as a large part of their economies are being hit particularly hard.
How should national leaders, businesses, and international organizations balance the risk of worsening disease that would be caused by the continued movement of people around the world against the risks of profound economic consequence of travel and trade bans?
If there's some sense that there's a UN institution that can do all of this, then I worry we're suffering from a delusional disorder on the power of the UN. It's really important to get those industries and their trade associations and an efficient leadership established, which is decentralized, but has a collective responsibility and accountability. And that needs to be supported by the public leadership.
What is essential, what is non-essential travel, we have to clarify this. Otherwise, if we go down to 20% bookings over a long period, the company will run down. That's a fact.
You know, there's a whole complex set of issues in a highly interdependent world on supply chains that are just in time. We need to think about how much flex there is in that just-in-time supply chain system and make sure it keeps running. I think it's going to take specificity, and it's going to take knowledge that only the private sector has. The UN can play an important coordinating facilitation role, but the companies know where those commodities are, where they move, how to move them, and that's where a type of public-private collaboration that we have not generally had in these crises needs to be put together pretty quickly.
We are not out of money, yet. But the fact is we are trending in a dangerous direction and something needs to change.
So the policy question for this board now is how should financial resources be prioritized? Are there nodes that we cannot allow to fail? What is your sense of priorities? We don't have money to pay for all of these urgent problems.
So at the moment, we want the funds, right? You need the money. So where's the money? So government kind of supplies some money. A lot of, private sectors, some are sitting here, so you have some money. But now you need a really coordinated, centralized efforts.
Hotels will be experiencing, crippling losses doing that. And we know that the hotel business in itself makes up 5% of the GDP.
Governments need to be willing to do things that are out of their historical perspective, or for the most part, it's really a war footing that we need to be on.
We shouldn't underestimate the power of entrepreneurship. We need to escalate that, whether it's through the government's helping with tax breaks or subsidies of that nature to increase manufacturing of those types of products. It can happen quickly. A Marshall-type plan, don't mean to say that exactly, but a Marshall plan that can go into effect can stimulate change very quickly.
Countries are reacting in different ways as to how best to manage the overwhelming amounts of and misinformation circulating over the internet. In some cases, limited internet shutdowns are being implemented to quell panic.
How much control of information should there be, and by whom? And how can false information be effectively challenged? And what if that false information is coming from companies or from governments?
I think it's very important that we make sure that there is concise communication with all healthcare facilities where these patients are being treated so that there isn't mass panic.
We're at a moment where the social media platforms have to step forward and recognize the moment to assert that they're a technology platform and not a broadcaster is over. They, in fact, have to be a participant in broadcasting accurate information and partnering with the scientific and health communities to counterweight, if not flood the zone of accurate information, because to put the genie back in the bottle of the misinformation and disinformation is nigh impossible.
One thing we haven't spoken about, and I'm wondering whether it's time to talk about this, is a step up from the part of the governments on enforcement actions against fake news.
I personally do not believe that trying to shut things down in terms of information is either practical or desirable. And we do have, I think, a couple of strategies that are available to us, one of which is the flood strategy, second of which is relying and informing and equipping trusted sources of information with the facts so they can then pass that on. But we also need to actually think about a technological answer to this.
The outcome of the CAPS pandemic in Event 201 was catastrophic. 65 million people died in the first 18 months. The outbreak was small at first and initially seemed controllable, but then it started spreading in densely crowded and impoverished neighborhoods of megacities. From that point on, the spread of the disease was explosive. Within 6 months, cases were occurring in nearly every country. The global economy was in a free fall. The GDP down 11%. Stock markets around the world plummeted between 20 and 40% and headed into a downward cycle of fear and low expectation. Businesses were not borrowing, banks were not lending. Everyone was just hoping to hunker down and weather the storm. Economists say the economic turmoil caused by such a pandemic will last for years, perhaps a decade. The societal impacts, the loss of faith in government, the distrust of news, and the breakdown of social cohesion could last even longer. We have to ask, did this need to be so bad? Are there things we could have done in the 5 to 10 years leading up to the pandemic that would have lessened the catastrophic consequences? We believe the answer is yes. So, are we as a global community now finally ready to do the hard work needed to prepare?
Describe for me as vividly as you can what it is you're worried about, what it is that the nightmare scenario looks like.
Fortunately, there's very few things, and most of them are very low probability. Some big volcanic explosion, gigantic earthquake, asteroid. But at least in the nuclear case, you've got to say we take it quite seriously. We budget a lot of money, have a lot of people who think about nuclear deterrence, and I'm very glad that work's being done, and I rate the chance of a nuclear war in my lifetime as being fairly low. I rate the chance of a widespread epidemic far worse than Ebola in my lifetime is well over 50%. If we look at the 20th century and we look at the death chart of the 20th century, I think everybody would say, oh yeah, there must be a spike for World War I. Sure enough, there it is, like 25 million. And there must be a big spike for World War II, and there it is, it's like 65 million. But then you'll see this other spike that is as large as World War II right after World War I. And most people, a lot of people would say, well, what? What was that? There's two kinds of flus. There's flus that spread between humans very effectively, and there's flus that kill lots of people. And those two properties have only been combined into a widespread flu once in history. Well, that is Spanish flu. We have no idea where it came from. It's called the Spanish flu because the Spanish press was the freest. They were the first to talk openly about it. And so in the annals of epidemic history, that's the big event. I funded a disease modeling group that uses computer simulation, and that work has been phenomenal in helping us target our polio eradication resources and which parts of Nigeria should we work harder on. And it's very natural if you have a group like that to say, hey, look at something like the Spanish flu in the modern day. Health systems are far better. And so you think, hey, that wouldn't be very bad. Well, we tried it, and there are some assumptions we had to make. But what we showed is that the force of infection because of modern transport, which compared to 1918 is over 50 times as great. And so if you get something like the flu, and you look at that map of how within days it's basically in all urban centers of the entire globe, that is very eye-opening. That didn't happen with Spanish flu in the past. The opportunity to do more than just let it run its course is really only in the last decade. Basically, when you talk about drugs, you can talk about small molecules or talk about these complex biological protein-like things, of which there's a subclass called antibodies. Antibodies are the molecules that the immune system naturally builds to attack disease. Today, the idea that somebody says, oh, here's an antibody, make a lot of it, make it very quickly, that's right on the cutting edge. And the Ebola epidemic showed me that we're not ready for a serious epidemic. An epidemic that would be more infectious and would spread faster than Ebola did. This is the greatest risk of a huge tragedy. This is the most likely thing by far to kill over 10 million excess people in a year. We don't need to invest nearly what we do in military preparedness. This is something where less than $1 billion a year on R&D, medical surveillance, standby personnel, cross-training the military so they can play a role in terms of all the logistics here. This can be done, and we may not get many more warnings like this one to say, okay, it's a pretty modest investment to avoid something that really, in terms of the human condition, would be a
In Iran, graves are being dug at an unusual speed in the cemetery in Qom.
احتمال ترقب وجود داره تا چه کار میکنه ابر هستش آماده خاکسپاری هست.
People in protective suits carry a coffin. Inside the cemetery's morgue, officials attempt to manage the situation. The government attempted to downplay the spread of the virus.
موافق نیستیم. قرنطینه مال قبل جنگ جهانی اول، مال طاعون و وبا و اینجور چیزاست. خود چینی‌ها
But videos and satellite imagery reveal how the situation quickly worsened after the government's slow response. High-resolution satellite imagery shows a cemetery in Qom undisturbed in October 2019. On February 19th, Iran announced its first 2 cases of coronavirus infections in Qom. But satellite imagery taken shortly after the announcement shows that 2 trenches are seen in the cemetery. Together, their lengths are that of a football field. By early March, we see a video of an overwhelmed morgue and cemetery in Qom. Video from the morgue shows several covered corpses on stretchers and the floor of the facility. There's a box labeled with the name of one of Iran's well-known clerics who died from coronavirus.
پیکر مرحوم خسروشاهی هست که چند روز اینجا مونده و هنوز تجهیز نشده.
There are several key pieces of evidence in this video and others that indicate the bodies being buried are connected to coronavirus. People burying corpses are in full-body protective medical suits. Iranian authorities confirmed they were using lime seen in the videos to line graves to prevent the spread of the virus within the cemetery. By March 6th, Iran acknowledged that the coronavirus had reached all 31 provinces. Videos emerged on social media of burials from different parts of the country. This clip was apparently taken in Saqqez, northwest Iran. The narrator is speaking with a regional accent. There appears to be piles of white powder beside the open graves. In another video, taken at the Bagrazvan cemetery of Urumia in northwest Iran, there are government officials and men in protective gear at the site. We identified these officials because red license plates in Iran belong to government vehicles. While the Iranian government appears to have improved their response,
عاجزانه از مردم میخوایم سفرها رو به حداقل برسونن، تماس‌ها با یکدیگر رو به حداقل برسونن و جداسازی بیماران رو هم کامل انجام بدن.
The Iranian government's initial minimizing of the virus's spread impacts more than just Iran. One country's response can have global consequences.
I found out last Friday that they were tested positive. I quarantined myself and got a test immediately and got the results back today. Look, this is serious, you know. Now's the time to really think about social distancing, washing your hands. Beyond that, there are people out there who aren't showing symptoms and that can easily spread. What's up, guys? So look, this morning I got some test results back for coronavirus and it came back positive. Yeah, and it sucks. Listen, I'm doing okay. Sabrina hasn't been tested and she's doing okay. I didn't have any symptoms. I got tested because I realized I was exposed to someone who had also tested positive. I found out last Friday that they were tested positive. I quarantined myself and got a test immediately and got the results back today. Look, this is serious, you know. Now's the time to really think about social distancing, washing your hands. Beyond that, there are people out there who...
Have you been tested?
I have. I've been tested. Actually, I found out this morning over that I tested positive. So, I'm not surprised. As soon as I heard that Idris was potentially exposed, I was on my way anyways. And I wanted to be with him. I think that's an instinct as a wife. You just want to go and take care. We didn't change the way we interact. I could have made a decision to put myself maybe in a separate room or stay away, and I'm sure that people are making those decisions and are tough decisions to make, but I made the decision to want to be with him and, still touch him.
We were on the alleged day of exposure, we were together at home and had been together right up until I had departed to come fly. So at any point then, and prior to us knowing, exposure was, if I had caught it, she had certainly caught it in that time period as well.
Asymptomatic, he said, and he is feeling fine. This is his quote from today on testing positive for coronavirus. Everyone be careful, take care of yourself, and quarantine. We're going to get through this. Durant was one of 4 players that the Nets announced tested positive for coronavirus. He joins Rudy Gobert, Donovan Mitchell, and Christian Wood as known positive tests for the coronavirus. Obviously, it was a clear message that the 2-time Finals MVP was sending to the rest of the world, to the rest of America. Be careful and stay quarantined.